Welcome back to the Tech Will Save Us podcast, and this week we're talking about technology in medicine, healthcare and science. So really exciting topics with some even more exciting guests to my left. So really hoping that I can understand some of the things that come out of your mouth. We've got the illustrious Dr. Tim Craggs and Mr. Dom Ronan. Welcome. So starting with you then, Tim, do you want to just give a little bit of a summary of sort of what you do, what area you're involved in, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I split my time between University of Sheffield and exciting instruments. So it's all exciting. You're going to get too many of those puns today, probably. But yeah, it's all very exciting. Exciting Instruments is a spin out from the University of Sheffield in the combination of the science from my lab and software from driven by Bulldozer and Razor. And we basically develop technology that allows us to look at one molecule at a time. So everything's made up of molecules, and we're particularly interested in biological molecules, protein and DNA, and the shapes that they adopt, because that is really important for how they work and their function, and critically how they don't work, and that's the link to healthcare and things like that. But we've got a company that creates instrumentation that allows people to look at these things really in that level of detail. And the kind of the route through this to the medicine side is really on the diagnostic side, because actually what's again quite exciting is that if you can literally detect one molecule, that is the kind of the ultimate limit of detection. Either there's a molecule there or there isn't. And so if you're trying to detect a marker for a disease, so we call them biomarkers, for cancer or something like that, you're much better off detecting the first biomarker. We're developing something in the Parkinson's kind of disease space at the moment. You're much better off detecting that first aggregate that would indicate that you're going to have some sort of plaque formation on the brain than you are actually having to detect the plaque in the brain, by which time it's too late. And so we've got a number of products in development that we're working on at the moment, from R&D stage, instrumentation into academic and industry labs, and some great collaborations with big tier 1 pharma companies and biotechs, but also now really bringing this to bear on that medical diagnostics side of things.
Mind blown already, 2 minutes in. And similarly, Dom, do you want to just give a brief sort of background to the sort of work that you're involved with? Yeah. Pretend I'm a 5-year-old.
Okay. Yeah. So for the 5-year-old purposes, I essentially take stuff that is in the wrong place, pack it neatly back into where it should be, and stitch it back up again, basically. But I do most of that in hands. So at the moment I'm working as a plastic surgeon in elective hand surgery, hand trauma, as a registrar in Sheffield. The bulk of my work is hand trauma at the moment. So people will come in having done nefarious different bits of mischief to their various bodily appendages. And my part of that is to reassure them that it will probably be fine.
Probably
get it back together in as kind of recognisable a hand as possible.
I see the bedside manner coming across already, right?
You already feel reassured, right?
Absolutely.
And then kind of pushing forward on that a little bit, kind of a serendipitous interaction with a friend of Razor led me, as I was pulling metal wires out of his finger and talking about how could we make this a little bit easier, he directed me to the team here, where we started to think about how we can make the whole surgical journey for the patient and surgeons a little bit more straightforward, which at the end of the day helps everyone in terms of saving money, saving time, saving fingers, because that's the important bit, and go from there. So yeah, from an interest in plastic and hand surgery, I've kind of crossed the barricade in terms of looking at how interesting things can be done with technology to make it much easier. So it's not necessarily just necessity kind of being the mother of the invention at the moment, but probably sheer laziness as well, in terms of helping us be more efficient with what we can do with the time that we have.
I think it's really interesting how those two things go together, isn't it? That for us, the necessity was the mother of invention for the very first kind of product that we developed, because I was given a bit of a very generous startup from University of Sheffield, but it wasn't enough to go out and buy the instrument that needed to do this, and so we were forced to build something of our own.
Right.
But I think there is also that a lot of the drive for us is that there is that laziness, and I think good scientists are in some ways inherently lazy. So that's going to need a little bit of qualification there. But in the sense that there is you really want to think through the experiments that you're doing, and you don't want to mess things up. You do want to do things, you practice, you try, and you learn, but there is an efficiency that you want to strive for. And I think that's important. And I think in our instrumentation as well, we really want to make part of the drive is that democratization of the method to make things as easy and as efficient as possible. And I think that's something that you guys are really thinking about as well, isn't it, in terms of time in theatre, efficiencies and flow.
If we can use technology to help doing the parts that are relatively straightforward in terms of taking time out of planning or taking time out of the trial and error aspect of surgery, then actually you can really focus on the really difficult, intricate parts of the operation, which is what we have been trained to do.
That's also the interesting bit, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the surgeon's dream, is that you can walk into the operation at the most interesting point, do the fun bit, everyone claps and you walk out, and there's someone to tidy up afterwards.
I love the clapping. That's the ones that have got the hands that are working.
Well, yeah.
That's brilliant.
So I think there's a lot of ground to be made with regards to technology in surgery that I don't think we have got there yet, but the possibilities are definitely.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So in it for the applause and in it for laziness, I suppose, is like a better word. I'm just curious as to sort of, you're both in such interesting areas, what your sort of motivations were to sort of start that journey into your respective areas and how that sort of came about. Starting with you, Tim.
I guess so. So I kind of came up through a classical kind of academic training, sort of undergrad and PhD at Cambridge, and sort of. But at that stage, even when I was doing my undergrad, I didn't really know I wanted to do a PhD. I kind of fell into it. It wasn't exactly laziness, but it was that I was just enjoying my student life. Right, I really, I was doing a lot of rowing, a lot of singing, a lot of music. We were talking about previously. A lot of violin playing, chapel choir singing, I was having a really good time. And that the PhD was a way of carrying on that where I was. But actually towards the end of my PhD, I found out I really enjoy science, right? I really, really enjoyed science. And it was the way that everything kind of comes together when, sort of, you get all of this disparate data and trying to actually make a narrative out of it and really understand something and progress the field. I think it's really exciting being. Here's the double pun, right? It's exciting being at the cutting edge, yes.
That's the tagline.
There you go. Exciting at the cutting edge. It's really exciting being at the cutting edge of things and doing things for the first time. That feeling of knowing that, when you've done an experiment that no one in the world has ever done before, that's something that no one else in the world knows. That's kind of cool, right? I mean, maybe that's the megalomaniac in me, but I do think that's exciting, really interesting, kind of fun element of the work. And from a synthesis side, if you've made something, maybe it's a compound, maybe it's a drug that no one's ever made before, or you've built, we've built an instrument now that it didn't exist a year ago, and now there's 6, 7 of these out in the wild, like we like to say, on other people's benchtops, and they're now making those groundbreaking discoveries that no one else is making, so enable, having gone from kind of making those discoveries myself to now enabling those discoveries from other people and ultimately developing that into something that's going to have a real impact on human health in the long term. That is truly exciting. So that I don't know whether that really answers the question, but it's kind of the motivation and a bit of the journey, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely answers the question. Yeah, sort of wanted to share all these exciting discoveries with the world and not just sort of keep it to yourself. Is it sort of a similar experience for you then?
I think so. Certainly, probably on kind of an academic level. When I started, I did an undergraduate degree at the University of Sheffield. Actually, I did a biomedical science degree.
Oh, yeah.
And so my kind of specialty, my dissertation was epigenetic inheritance and kind of how it relates to different theories of evolution, so kind of Lamarck versus Darwin.
And this is kind of the giraffe's neck kind of gradually gets longer, to reach for the food, rather than a natural selection approach, which was the more Darwinian idea, wasn't it?
Precisely, yeah, exactly that. So
I've got that right. I remembered something.
and actually, kind of a lot more in terms of the genetic field is going towards an epigenetic type level of acquired inheritance.
Right, and this
acquired
just
characteristic.
Again, just for my own brain, that's the difference between, so the genetics is like the individual letters in the DNA, right? And then the epigenetics is other, often methylation or changes that are kind of stamps on top of that, sort of highlights, I guess you could talk about, if you like, in terms of, if you've got the code is the words, the epigenetics is kind of like the underlining of different bits.
Exactly, yeah, I think that's exactly it. Because if you have kind of a great long word, you can make smaller words out of it. And the epigenetics is exactly that, the underlining of the different letters in that larger word to create a smaller word. And so by looking at that, actually, if you think about all your cells, with the right kind of magic potion of chemicals, you can reprogram it to become any other cell. So actually all of that information is still there in the cell. You just need to find a way of triggering the right switches, as it were, to make it do what you want it to do. So skin cell, you could reprogram and turn it into a gut cell. And so that's kind of the epigenetic side of it. And actually, you can look at whether something that you do during your life, so for example, eating a huge amount of food and becoming very fat, could slow down your metabolism, because actually you don't necessarily need a fast metabolism if you're eating a huge high-calorie diet. That can then be programmed in the epigenetics. So actually your genetic code is selecting which proteins to create to slow down your metabolism. And you can look at studies kind of from India, where actually people who have previously had a very low calorie diet and now suddenly are exposed to kind of a Western diet, fast food and high calorie, readily available sort of meals, and actually they put on weight much quicker. And so it's kind of this, it's not necessarily a change to the genetic code, but actually it's a way that the genetic code is being read. And so that's kind of the epigenetic side of it, and how it's changing our thoughts on how people and different animals and things will evolve. So that kind of got me interested in kind of how the body works and why it works and what we do to influence what happens to our own bodies. Part of that degree as well, brilliant degree, recommended.
That's a plug.
We did cadaveric dissection for 2 years. So we were very privileged to be able to work with donated bodies and dissect it kind of top to toe, sequentially looking at it, how it worked, the biomechanics of it. And actually when we were doing kind of a bit gruesome, but kind of looking underneath the face and having a look, and kind of we were like, oh, something's a bit weird in our particular model. And she'd had a facelift. She'd had kind of some bits pulled back, and it was pulling us the face up behind her ear. And so the demonstrator came over, had a look, and said, look, what happens if you cut it? And you cut it, and it all kind of moves, and suddenly everything that was in perfect balance and is now shifted. And I was like, that's pretty clever. Ended up kind of enjoying that immensely, going into medical school, and actually one of my placements looking at to be a plastic surgery placement, where one of the surgeons at the end of his 5 o'clock clinic said, can you come and help me with an operation? The orthopedic guys have asked me to cover a great big hole over a knee that they've made. And he said, I need an assistant. And I was like, yeah, I'd love to. So kind of 7 p.m, young Dom was kind of holding this great big kind of 100-kilo bloke's leg up in the air for about 3 hours, whilst the plastic surgeon kind of meticulously dissected kind of the muscles at the back of his leg, took it off at the bottom, rotated it round, cover over the hole, stitch it back in, put a skin graft over the top. And I was like, the ability to know the mechanics of the body so intimately, to be able to kind of wander into any situation and say, yeah, I can sort that out, and have the knowledge of the plumbing, as it were, of the body, to be able to switch that around to be for a functional and working outcome, blew my mind.
Well, the skill to manipulate that as well, not just to understand it from a theoretical level, but to actually have your own fine motor skill ability to actually deliver it as well.
The trust in yourself to
phenomenal.
And yeah, I was blown away from that point. and since then I've kind of followed plastic surgery, which brought me back to Sheffield and the hand centre, kind of one of the biggest hand centres in the country. I think one of the recent red cap studies that we looked at has probably got the highest throughput of hand trauma of anywhere else in the country. And you only need to see the inside of a couple of hands to realise how fabulous the biomechanics of it are, kind of pulleys, levers, muscles, joints, kind of various ways, and actually kind of they're beautiful constructs that are so kind of delicate. And it's really been a joy to work on. So working on them has been an absolute privilege, and now I reckon I've met a nice sort of group of people that are pretty keen on helping make it even better for people in terms of outcomes. And then here we are.
Absolutely. We just see Tim there sort of trying to understand the mechanics of the hand and how intricate and fascinating it must be.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Just interesting then, what looking back, which sort of tech innovation do you consider to have the biggest impact on your sort of respective areas in the last sort of 10 years?
I think so. I don't want to give the game away, but kind of I was a little bit pre-prepared for this question, and I thought about it quite a bit. But actually, in hand surgery, in the last 10 years, there's not been any enormous specialty changing development. I don't feel, and I think a lot of that is because hand surgery is a very experience-based tactile specialty, where actually working with the tissues and understanding how it all works is all very much under the auspices of the surgeon who's doing it. And the more that you work with the hands and the more you see the patients afterwards, kind of you fine-tune your abilities and skills. The actual equipment is relatively simple, like fork spoon. And
it's not a great image that just conjured for me, I've got to say.
And whereas the actual thing that we do has been relatively unchanged for a long time. But I think a lot of that is because of how small and intricate hands are, that actually one of the only things that is able to manipulate that at a level that's appropriate for a reconstructive surgeon is their own hands and the small instruments that you use. So you can make kind of small instruments, but actually the only real kind of developments have been slightly an improvement of the materials of the equipment we use. For example, very, very tiny sutures, 9.0, 10.0 sutures, which are fractions of a millimetre in size that we use.
Sutures is the actual needle that you use to do
so the needle and the thread, which is all kind of formed of one little part. So kind of we'll use a microscope, and kind of the faintest breeze will blow the thread away. But so for the tensile strength in something so small is actually very, very good in that sort of thing. And actually that has made certainly trauma surgery, trying to get little nerves back together under a little bit of tension. And the tensile strength of these materials have been really useful. But in terms of great sweeping changes within the profession, I was just saying the most recent one that probably changed, was an absolute game changer, was X-rays in 1895. So I think that we are at a point now where technology has progressed to such an extent that they probably can be as accurate or more accurate than what we can do ourselves. So I think that's where the real excitement from my side of things certainly is that we can now start to have an impact with the advent of more technology, AI, kind of robotics, that sort of thing.
Very cool. I guess for us the kickoff for our field, I guess, right, is the first single molecule kind of detection experiment, and the sort of in the area that we work in is this it's called FRET, first resonance energy transfer. Basically, the experiment that Tajit Par and Shimon Weiss's lab did in the late 90s at UCLA, and that's where they were able to measure this transfer as energy between a kind of a donor and an acceptor, literally in that one molecule at a time, and that was that really just exploded then the whole of this entire field. And so that for in terms of a breakthrough technology, in a sense, I think was a critical moment for single molecule threat, certainly. But and then we kind of grow with that to sort of so, and now that there are our own technological enhancements within exciting instruments is taking the 20 nearly 30 years since that kind of initial work was done, and trying to distill that down into something that clinicians even a clinician could use. No. I mean, but someone who's not who isn't a trained expert in this area, right, but just could use a piece of kit as they would use a knife, fork, and spoon, right? To have that ease of use, and to take something that was initially, these sorts of instruments, have not often been literally, well, like all scientific instrumentation at some point, they were actually, you used to have to build the experiment before you did the experiment. You literally build the kit, right? And it's the same, I guess, in surgery, that people initially had to make the instruments. They had to, design the saw, or a horrible thought, whatever, the scalpel, all of the, like you were talking about, the sutures, all of those different things. So I think that you start off there, and that's where our field was maybe 30 years ago. And when then someone makes this amazing discovery, is able to work with and literally, detect that one molecule at a time. And then part of our role in this now going forward, and myself in the field for the last 20 years, I guess, has been to take that and distill it into something that's now, literally can just sits on a bench top. It's like a CD. It's got lots of lasers in, but it's effectively a CD player. It's completely safe and very easy to use. And no one using a CD player, you don't need a PhD, right? Well, no one uses CD players anymore, right? Well, you might, right? But okay, your PS4 or 5, right? You're still putting a disc in, right? Well, you don't, but there's loads of lasers in there. It's like Blu-ray, right? Why is it called Blu-ray? It's because you're now using a blue laser rather than a longer wavelength laser, and that's really interesting, right? Because the blue is a shorter wavelength, which means you can cram more information onto your Blu-ray, which is why you get high resolution. You can fit more info on there, so you get high res, film out of it.
I suppose that's kind of the dream, isn't it? If you can get something that was an industrial experiment that someone has built on a large scale into something that can sit on the desk, actually it becomes very widely available, and everyone can do their own little bit with it, and it's
right. And it becomes a platform technology, and you see that with computing. So you guys will know better than me, but mainframe computers were the only computers that existed. They were the size of a room. They were it was valves, and it was massively interesting mechanical stuff. And then in the end, this is why Bill Gates is where he is, because they had a vision of how you take something colossal, complicated, really difficult, and you put it literally, I mean, what's it called? It's called a desktop, right? They put it on everyone's desktop. That's the vision. That's what we've done with exciting instruments, is take that something that's the size of a room, really difficult, really complicated, only experts can use, like that mainframe, and put it on a benchtop. So I think that approach is really powerful. But from the tech perspective, it's that first single molecule threat experiment was critical.
And what's the significance of studying the single molecule?
Yeah, that's a really important question, right? And I think the one way to think about it is if you're at a basketball game, okay, my middle child Leo loves basketball, so and I'm in the States too often these days installing instruments, but so you've got on the court you've got maybe 10 really tall players, right, and then you've got the rest of us mere mortals kind of as the spectators. But if you were to plot that on a histogram, on a graph, you'd have like a group of people kind of here who are really tall, and then you'd have a load of everybody else over here who are normal height. But if you only have access to the average, the population average, that's kind of here. Well, no one, that's not representative of what's going on actually at the, in the system. And biology is just like that. We've been talking about epigenetics, we've been talking about there is a lot of heterogeneity, differences between different cells and even different molecules. So many molecules actually exist in different shapes, conformations, same word, but different word, same meaning, to do their job. And, one example I often give, there's a polymerase that we've worked on, something that copies DNA and it's a kind of really important enzyme, but it exists in this open conformation or a closed conformation like that. Now, if it spends half of its time like this and half of its time like this, when you do an ensemble measurement, right, where you get the average conformation from many hundreds of millions of billions of molecules, well, you record that conformation. How many molecules were in that conformation? 0. None were, because half of them were like this and half of them. So you're just wrong. You don't know. And actually it becomes really important for drug discovery, which shape of the molecule is my drug interacting with? That's really important for people to know. But also then that sensitivity element that we kind of touched on a bit earlier, that you either the molecule is there or it's not. And so to be able to detect literally at that level of sensitivity, that's incredibly powerful for these sort of medical diagnostics. Because you want to get that first, as we said, detect that first kind of pre-aggregate that's going to go on to form, the plaque in the brain for Parkinson's or something like that. If you can detect the first coming together of the two molecules that in the end are going to form this massive aggregate, well, that will give you a massive advantage at getting ahead of those diseases, because at the moment the treatments for those diseases unfortunately are kind of preventative in the sense that they prevent further degradation and worsening of the disease, but there's no real drugs out there in most of the dementia space for actually improving the condition. So it's really a question of just stopping things in their tracks. So the sooner we can diagnose those types of diseases, the more efficacious, the better, the drug, the chances and the outcomes for those patients, because with the existing drugs that we've got. So
I think certainly from a healthcare point of view, the best test is something that's highly sensitive, but also highly specific.
Yes.
Not necessarily kind of one or the other, but both of them together make something a very reliable test. So particularly, as you say, for things like diagnostics, it's incredibly helpful to have something that you can reliably test for, but also know what it means once you've tested for it. And that's kind of the basis of how you'd get one diagnosed and therefore start a treatment plan. So actually kind of that initial test bit is the vital part of the wheel, really.
Yeah, and I think what's exciting about some of the routes we're going in the diagnostics is that it might also be not just that initial diagnostic that we get out, but it could then also be used as to track, if the treatment is then still working as well, or the efficacy of other newer treatments and newer drugs, because if you've got something that's detecting this molecule, alpha-synuclein, that's important in some of these Parkinson's and Lewy body formation, some of these diseases. Well, if you're then taking a drug that's supposed to, prevent further formation or further issues, then you've got a way of monitoring that at a molecular level. Is it working? Not just the more macro things like we were talking about, the imaging or the actual function. That may not get worse immediately, but it could still be getting worse. Whereas if you've got that really precision tool, like you say, that sensitive, specific tooling that allows you to monitor this stuff, that can be really powerful.
And I think because that will trump clinical change. Because a lot of the time, the only way we've got of monitoring whether the trajectory of degenerative disease is by seeing them regularly at follow-up, whereas actually seeing them kind of sequentially, we might not get a full appreciation for how much someone is deteriorating, but with a measurable test. Or, for example, they might go to clinic and see 3 different doctors, all of which say, yeah, it's probably dementia, but it might be getting much significantly worse, and actually you can get help in earlier. Whereas if you have a test that's relatively easy to perform, actually you can quantify a change much earlier than any sort of clinical presentation or noticeable change the person from a clinical point of view.
I think that's it, right? As soon as you've got effectively some sort of number, you can follow something, and then that it becomes much less sort of what's the opposite of objective? Thank you. It becomes much less subjective. I don't deal in subjective. I don't know the word. It becomes much less subjective because you aren't just looking at it. Like you say, I think that's really important. And not something I'd really thought about before. That consistency of diagnosis between different doctors, right?
Yeah.
That if we can make that more consistent, that's also really important. But if you can put some numbers on things. And then you can follow the trajectory that people are going on. You can see whether the treatment they're taking is actually helping or not, and all that kind of stuff. It becomes really powerful, actually.
Exactly, and kind of we're looking at it, a bit of a shameless plug. But we're looking at doing some research at the moment, looking at scars. So scars are very variable, person to person. Some people might really like the very big sharp bite scar that they have. Some people find it horribly disfiguring, but it's very difficult to be able to quantify how much a scar affects someone. So actually, we can do things about scars. We can inject fat under scars, which is what we're working on at the moment, to see whether it actually improves the scar, whether it's kind of the pressure of just injecting something that improves the scar kind of biomechanically, physiologically. And the assessment of scars is an incredibly difficult thing to be able to quantify, much in the same way that previously dementia or degenerative disease has been. In that, but now kind of you use just about to publish a paper that looks at a combination of different ways to score scars, which has a subjective and objective part to it. Nice. So you get what the patient feels about their scar versus what the clinician thinks the scar looks like and how it affects the patient. And you can put it together and get a number. So regardless of who looks at the scar, you can get a relatively reliable number that you can repeat time and time again along in a timeline, and you can see whether it's improving or not. And I think that is the big thing about technology in healthcare, enormously, is that pattern recognition on a much bigger scale.
And that quantitation, right? And the pattern recognition, obviously, then that does speak to the kind of machine learning approaches, AI approaches that will be coming in, no doubt, on this. And but I think that the way that takes things forward in it comes back to something you were saying earlier as well. It's like using technology to do the bits that technology's good at, to allow us to do the bits that we really enjoy and we are really good at as well. And that pattern recognition, at the end of the day, actually it's one of those things that our eyes and our brains are also extremely good at, aren't they? Think about facial recognition and stuff like that. We have been tuned, to do this extremely well. But that said, the getting tech involved in that part of the process is hugely valuable, and that consistency that brings, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah, and that's it, isn't it? It's stopping things fall through the gap that might otherwise have been missed from a healthcare point of view.
Well, especially from if you think about machine learning AI stuff, that that you run the computer for 24/7, it doesn't need a break, and it doesn't get tired in that same way. It's not like, I've got to look at one more radio cardiogram, whatever the things are. You just
and you get fatigued, and you need a coffee, or you get a phone call when you're looking at a scan, and you get interrupted. But that doesn't really happen with a computer.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, just how significant do you think the sort of, you touched on the machine learning AI stuff, how significant could that be to your sort of respective areas, and is it just that sort of using it as a tool and embracing it and freeing you up to do the things that are really important to you guys? I know, Dom, you sort of touched on it earlier. Is that something that you've already explored or exploring?
So that's why I came to Razor. So really, kind of, this is what we kind of was the dream, was the concept that. And kind of we mentioned that the better surgeons are usually the more experienced surgeons, because they appreciate what the impact of what they do on what happens to the patient 6, 12, 18 months down the line when they see them in clinic, and they think, maybe I shouldn't have cut that bit. But so if you can amalgamate that breadth and depth of knowledge from every operation that has happened in the past, and kind of then you can create almost a framework from which a more junior person can learn from or be guided by, based on thousands of operations that have happened before. And so the the easier way to think about it from a practical sense is fracture fixation. If you have an image of a fracture before an operation in quite a high resolution, a lot of detail, and then you look at the fracture after the operation, after it's been fixed, how it's been fixed, what angle they went in, what they used to fix it, what they did afterwards, what position they held it in. And if you take account of all of that, all of those variables, and re-put it into the system as an input and an output, then actually you can predict what will happen to this fracture that walks through the door that you scan, and they say, actually, this fracture configuration doesn't work that well if we just put little wires in to hold it together. It actually works much better if we put a couple of little screws in this particular orientation. And we have seen from the past 30,000 operations that were done in the past 5 years that actually patients get a much better functional outcome. And from that, you can extrapolate it and ask AI, what procedure do I do? And it will say, based on the rest of it, you'll do this. But it could also guide you in the way that you do it. So actually, kind of the ultimate, the dream, the last slide in my presentation is the augmented reality part of it.
Yeah.
Where actually, if you have a guidance system that can tell you what angle to drill it in and what size screw you need, what size drill bit you need, which angle to come in at so you don't roger the important stuff that's in there.
It's a technical.
Rogering.
And then you can line it up and put the screw in. And actually you turn something that maybe a handful of very specialist people can do into something that is a bit more widespread. And so rather than waiting weeks for your operation, it can be done there and then. And I think that's where technology will help us. And I think a lot of technology in healthcare is a lot of kind of the epidemiological crowdsourced medicine of picking up those patterns. And it will I think it will happen everywhere, kind of in radiology, looking at thousands of x-rays of people with lung cancer or a problem in their lung. Actually, it picks up what are the signs that are related to lung cancer. And so it might be that some of the x-rays that you get are so subtle that even a very highly trained radiologist might not be able to pick them up, particularly on a kind of a low quality radiograph. Whereas if you had a pattern recognition that was looking at hundreds of thousands of data points on each scan, almost within milliseconds, you can maybe pick that up weeks, months earlier, and actually you can intervene earlier. So I think a lot of the AI in healthcare is somewhat untapped. Because it's not the way that we've always done it, but I think that sort of thing needs to be uprooted in healthcare, and actually it's a resource that we can make quite a lot of use out of.
And what are taking his job? But what are the barriers to that? What are the blockers that prevent more of that happening now?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is scale.
Yeah,
and that is, I suppose, probably intertwined with desire, really, in that every different hospital trust in the country will have their own way of organising, managing and deciding what the funds are allocated to.
Yeah.
So if you had someone in a radiology department somewhere saying, actually, this is a really good idea, let's try it out, then you'd have to justify why you're spending money on that where everyone else isn't spending money on that. And so that's where research is important in saying, actually, you get a clinical benefit from this. And I'm sure it's kind of the same kind of commercial view. If no one's going to spend money on your instrument if you can't prove that it works.
Absolutely.
And so I think there is a little bit is the difficulty. There's, I suppose, particularly at the moment, and particularly in healthcare, there's a huge amount of weight given to the morality or the ethics of a new intervention. So actually, if we put all of the x-rays from everyone in the past 100 years into a database, actually, is that something that someone who was getting their x-ray 50 years ago would have been happy with us doing? And kind of the ethical journey around that, I think, takes a lot of time, particularly, say, in kind of the Leviathan of the NHS.
Yeah.
And that is very difficult. It's turning a barge. So, whilst small little projects will show small gains. Actually, you probably need something on a
So we need a much
bigger
bigger,
scale.
an overarching,
Yeah.
a real oversight. This has got to come at a political level by the sounds of it. This really needs government, proper policy decisions to drive this.
Yeah, exactly. It needs kind of a meta-analysis rather than because it's a small local trial. It needs kind of thinking on an AI level, on a global level, and but I think a lot of it is possibly the ethical side of it.
And it comes down to that ethics, and that gets interesting, doesn't it? Because it's about, like you say, it's about data and ownership. The GDPR has been a big thing. Most recently, I guess. But like you say, it's hard to know. 50 years ago, what would someone want or whatever else? And at some point, I guess we've got to say, well, okay, we've just got to draw a line and say, do you know what? For the common good, we just need to make sure that as part of the process, and maybe it's just part of it. It becomes part of the idea of as part of, you're being treated by the NHS as part of that exchange. Yes, you're paying your national insurance. It's free at point of view. It's not free, but as part of that process, the research, your data for research purposes does need to be available to people. And maybe we just need to have that conversation a bit more in public, so that people are always just aware of that. But that's because it makes sense for them, and makes sense for their children. Or if it were me, I'm not sure I'd even allow them to opt out. They can opt out, but if they opt out of the help as well. All right. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that goes too far. I don't know. Honestly, I think because there is a discussion to be. Let's have that debate. I guess I think is what I would say. I think it's really important that the people are aware of these things, and that if we want our NHS to be world leading, which we say we do, and is a very well. Let's not get too political, but yeah, absolutely. Then how we maintain that and how we move forward, because technology is always moving forward, right? And actually, if any sector isn't moving forward, it's necessarily therefore moving backward compared to competitors and relative to the rest of the world, and that's not where we want to be. So it's really interesting.
I suppose on a slightly more flippant note, if you've got 2 surgeons in the country that are very adept at this one particular operation, you're going to put them out of the job by getting AI in and actually telling everyone how to do their operation.
So there is an ego.
Yeah, and there was.
I mean, surgeons are never famous for their ego, right?
Exactly. And you're not going to get the old boys.
And it is old boys, unfortunately.
Welcoming in this kind of technology that undermines what they have put 60 years of work into learning.
Well, except that there is, I don't know, and that's where I hope there could be a transition, because actually it goes back to kind of what we're doing. It's not like we've developed a whole bunch of kit, and that has been 20 years of my life, but the joy for me is then not in just keeping that to myself and being the only person in the world who can do all of these things, but actually in going, the bigger impact is everybody being able to use it and to do their own things and run with it, and then it spurs off a million other side reactions or whatever, companies, prospects, discoveries, and so but there is this, like you say, I guess there is this empire of and kind of network of individuals sometimes who do like to be the only person who can do
the eminent professor.
Exactly, and we have that now.
Great. Well, it all goes back to the start about sort of democratising this and making it available for everyone, right?
From our perspective, absolutely, and the great. I mean, we started this off with an open source piece of kit, right? So the Smurf box, the single molecule fret box, which we built in the lab, as a matter of necessity, as we came back to that necessity being the mother of invention, and we kind of stripped everything back. We went, okay, we can't afford an actual microscope here. What does the microscope do in our particular setup? Well, actually, we also then we add lasers and detectors and mirrors and lenses, and in the end, the microscope for us was literally just a glorified hunk of metal holding the objective lens, right? That's literally because we were adding everything else around it, and so we were like, well, that's silly. So we just got rid of the microscope, right? And just built it out of little bits of metal. So instead of spending 40 grand on a commercial microscope, we spent £400 on 4 pieces of aluminium. And that's the approach that we've taken, to really strip back, to go right back to basics and just build something for the exact purpose. And I guess, we're talking with investors a lot at the moment, which is all going really well, really exciting. And they're often like, well, what's the secret sauce? And because they want to know what they're putting their money into, right? But the secret sauce is being, and it actually comes back to something one of my mentors said to me before I started my lab here in Sheffield. And he said, the secret sauce actually is the same in the company as it is in the way that I run everything else. It's you've got to work out everything has to be good enough, but it doesn't need to be over-engineered. And when you give yourself, of course, a chunk of bandwidth over and above what you think is going to be needed, that isn't over-engineering, that's sensible planning, right? You might build your bridge for general usage, but you're always going to build it so that if a line of massive juggernaut trucks come across it, it's still going to survive. Of course you do that. But what we've done with the Smurf box, and then on that the commercial version of the instrument, the Flex, and then the V2, which is open for a name. If anyone's got fun ideas,
put it in the comments. Put it in the comments below.
Comments below. What we're going to call the second version of our exciting instruments. But is going literally stripping back and being just good enough and not being over-engineered, which is what that microscope body was. It did about 15,000 different things, all pretty well, but it didn't do the one thing that we needed, brilliantly. It did loads of other things, and so that, I think there's those two different routes through it, aren't there? There's having a kind of the sort of the penknife model, right, where you've got 50 different tools and none of them are quite right, but they're all pretty good, right? Or there's let's have that precision scalpel, that one tiny suture that's exactly engineered to do exactly what you need. And that's kind of where we've gone in the end. It's here's an instrument now that does, it does exactly what a lot of people need, but it's super easy to use. It's not got the rest of that gubbins around it. And so it does, that democratization is critical. And actually, to kind of just complete that story, that we started off trying to do this in the lab and doing it in the lab, and we've built this instrument. We've made all the parts available. We can put the link on the stuff. We've got all of that's available. It's all published in one of the nature journals, and it's almost IKEA style Lego instructions of how to build it. You can click a button and download all of the parts that you need and all of that kind of stuff. We've made it really easy, and we're like, oh well, look, loads of people can build this now. 2 other labs have built it now, but that was the motivation for the company, because actually what people the need and the want is there, but the skills that you need even to build this are not the same set of skills that you need to operate it as a scientist. It's a completely different person. The biologist who wants to understand the biology can use this kit to do their experiments, but they couldn't build it. That's a completely different person and different skill set. And the way that in academia often it works, and in industry it's the same. You need someone who's just going to use it. You don't need, you want a turnkey solution, is I guess what they call them, right? Where you just rock up, you switch it on, and you do what you want to do with it, not all of the maintenance and all of the rest of it. So we've removed that pain point. People don't have to build these things themselves. They don't have to be optics experts. They don't have to be engineers. They can be biologists. They can be the person with the interesting question. They can be drug discovery companies. They can be, they can be the clinician who wants to know, has this person got, late stage Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, or what's going on, right? And that's the power of that approach, where we then just give them that tool, and it's super easy to use. And the advent of the technology there is both in the hardware, where we've developed something that's bench top, and like we said, this kind of class 1 laser product like your CD player, so you don't need to worry about lasers pop in your eyes or anything like that. But it's also critically in the software, where, because that UX, that user experience, is absolutely crucial actually, and that's where it's been really good to work with you guys on some of those things. We've learned a lot, I think, around leading people through from a user experience perspective. And the reality is that so much scientific software, it is just foul, right? It's like stuff from it's 80s, 90s. It's just disgusting. It's just really hard and it's not just aesthetically unpleasing, which you can forgive, right? But it's just from an actual usability, it's just not there. It's not intuitive. It's not straightforward. It might be functional, but to actually eke out the function, it's almost impossible, right? For anybody, even really trained people, it's really hard. So that's the other side of the business for us is really making, you having software that is just intuitive, really straightforward, just leads people through. It does everything you need it to do, but in a way that is just really obvious to the user. And that's really important.
I think that's kind of the absolute crux of a lot of healthcare provision in terms of from the end user point of view. If you can go into a clinic and the doctor says, I think it might be this, let's do a test. Let's take them to the back of the lab, runs it through the machine, comes back and says, no, I'm really sorry, I think it is Parkinson's disease. But then the patient leaves with a diagnosis. The patient doesn't get told, it might be Parkinson's, it might be Alzheimer's, it might be Lewy body dementia, it might be anything under the sun, but we're not going to know until we see how it progresses over the next 5 years. Actually, you can go in and you can know. And some people might not like the idea of knowing and just leave it in the hands of the medical professionals, and that's fine. But some people would want to know, and you can then move on with your life or prepare for whatever that entails.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, and I think that it's also there's two different parties involved there in the knowing, isn't there? There's the medical team knowing, and them knowing is always going to be better, right? Because they can then at least plan. But I think there is, like you say, there are some people though that for whom the knowing itself actually removes some of the stress, and there is the mental health load on individuals if they don't know what's wrong. They can get that can really stress people out. Now clearly getting a really nasty diagnosis is still going to have a mental impact on you, but at least at that point you do
quantify it
and you know what it is, and it's not an unknown situation. And I don't know, maybe I certainly used to be a bit of a worrier, and you get to a point where if you don't know, that people's minds go to the worst possible outcome. Now, at least that's not to say that you might then be told it is the worst possible outcome, but at least you're not worrying about it at that point. So I think that's really interesting as well. And so hopefully in the future, that's where we're going to get in the next couple of years for some of these things. Is that some of that giving people that certainty and that planned approach, because that's a horrible idea to so you already got to the point where you've worked up the courage to go to the clinic. You've been fed through probably from your GP. So there's been a wait already before you get to the consultant appointment, and then a consultant sort of does his exam, her exam, looks at all of the data and all the rest of it, but then says, well, come back in 6 months, come back in 12 months, come back in 2 years. And if you've lost motion in your arms and this is happening, then it's Parkinson's. You're like, great, right? So no, that's some of what we're trying to solve.
Great stuff. Well, guys, unfortunately, we're going to have to end there. I know we could talk about this all day, and I'm sure we'll carry on talking about it when the camera finishes. But you paint a really exciting image of tech in your respective fields. So thank you very much for coming on. Tim, thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very
John,
much.
It's been great, and thank you very much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.